Hello, everybody. Welcome and welcome back to New Mexico Black Leadership Council's Afrofuturism Lecture Series. Today is part two of our three-part series centering around Afrofuturism. This event is part of the 10th annual New Mexico Black History Festival, which has extended beyond February, Black History Month, into a year-round celebration, which is why we are so excited to bring you this series honoring and uplifting our Black superheroines in March, which, as we know, is Women's History Month. Thank you so much for being here with us today. If you're joining us for the first time, or if you're coming back from our last series, and a special thanks to our partner, University of New Mexico African American Student Services, for assisting us in spreading the word about this series. My name is Mason Graham, and I'm the Digital Content and Special Projects Lead for NMBLC. In case you can't see me too well through the Zoom camera, there's a photo of myself there. And believe it or not, I used to have a pretty huge afro myself. And then after that, I had a set of locks, but I couldn't find a picture of either one of those things. So we'll have to settle for this. Now, if you don't know about New Mexico Black Leadership Council, or NMBLC, we serve as a hub to create a viable and sustainable social profit sector in New Mexico. It is important to recognize our building is located on indigenous, unceded Tiwa land and what is now known as the city of Albuquerque, New Mexico. Our services and programs focus on 5 key areas, which are civic engagement, health, leadership development, positive youth development, and cultural vibrancy. Our lecture series today encompasses the cultural vibrancy portion of that wheel of engagement there. And it's my honor to be your host today on this mission. Now, before we get started, I want to bring attention to another historical achievement for Black women, and that is the recent recognition from NASA for science fiction author Octavia E. Butler. Earlier this month, NASA named the landing site of the Perseverance Mars rover in her name, as pictured here on your screen. Perseverance is not just the name of the rover, but a description of Octavia as her work in the predominantly white male world of science fiction. She broke barriers in her own right as she gave readers of all ethnicities a look into her beautiful and creative mind in her acclaimed novels, Kindred and Parable of the Sower. She was the first Black woman to win Hugo and Nebula Awards, which honor the best in the science fiction genre, and became the first science fiction writer to receive a MacArthur Fellowship. Her stories explore themes like racism, slavery, time travel, vampires, and aliens, and her novels are cornerstones of Afrofuturism, which makes her honored landing site on Mars and her mention here today very timely. And you can say the work of Octavia Butler gave way to the stories that we're discussing in this very series by opening the doors for Black women to explore all areas of creativity and artistic expression. So without further ado, let me introduce you to Dr. Finney Coleman, who is the moderator of our lecture series. Dr. Coleman is president of the Faculty Senate at the University of New Mexico, where he teaches courses in African American literature, history, and culture. Welcome back, Dr. Coleman. I'm happy to have you here with us today. I see you got a couple matching guitars, as I do in the background there. Oh, that mute button.
Yeah, let me get unmuted there. Hey, Mason, thank you for that introduction. I'm so excited to be here this afternoon with everyone. Welcome everyone to Afrofuturism, from our screens to reality. As Mason mentioned before, this is part 2 of a 3-part lecture series. We will discuss what a new generation of Black women superheroes has looked like through the lens of Afrofuturism. Last week, hopefully you were here last week and you were able to see the incredible presentation by Dr. Belinda Wallace, who taught us a great deal about Lovecraft Country and the character Hippolyta. Next week, we will conclude the series with our very own Dr. Andrea Mays from the University of New Mexico. She's also from the University of New Mexico. Her presentation will be on Janelle Monáe's emotion picture, Dirty Computer. So please come and join us next week for Dr. Mays, her presentation. We continue our series this afternoon with my dear friend, my sister, Dr. Kimberly Nichele Brown of Virginia Commonwealth University. Dr. Brown will provide an in-depth look at Watchmen, featuring Regina King. Welcome, Dr. Brown. I want to say a little bit about Dr. Brown. Dr. Kimberly Nichele Brown is an associate professor of gender, sexuality, and women's studies at Virginia Commonwealth University, where she formerly served as the chair of gender, sexuality, and women's studies, as well as the Department of African American Studies. Before becoming to VCU, Professor Brown taught for 14 years in the Department of English at Texas A&M University. Dr. Brown and I both started the same year at Texas A&M University, and in that same department. When she was there in the English department at Texas A&M, she also co-founded and directed the Africana Studies program. Her areas of specialization include contemporary African-American women's literature and culture, Black feminist theory, Africana film, Afrofuturism, and 20th century American and Africana literatures. Professor Brown is the author of Writing the Black Revolutionary Diva, Women's Subjectivity and Decolonizing Text. I want to say that title again. This is a fantastic book by Dr. Brown. Again, the title, Writing the Black Revolutionary Diva, Women's Subjectivity and the Decolonizing Text. Professor Brown is currently working on 2 book-length manuscripts, Incognito Stances, Cross-Racial Espionage in Contemporary Literature and Film. That book is under contract with the University of Mississippi Press. And then another book, Through Ebony Eyes, a Black feminist and ethical praxis of viewing contemporary film. I want to say a little bit more. There are 2 other, there's other projects that I want to mention very, very briefly that Dr. Brown is working on, again, Through Ebony Eyes, and that work has appeared in anthologies such as African American Cinema Through Black Lives Consciousness, Hollywood's Africa After 1994, and Slavery and the Post-Black Imagination. And I can tell you that biography, that introduction doesn't do justice to my good friend, my sister, Kimberly Brown. Welcome, Kimberly.
Thank you for having me.
Wow. So we have a lot of stuff to go through this afternoon. Before we start the lecture, we have an opening query for all of you to respond to, right? In order to participate in the query, we ask that you click the link that has been dropped in the chat. If you look over here to the right, you'll find that link. Click on that or scan the QR code on your screen to access the question. Once we finish the opening query and the lecture begins, please keep that link open. At the end of the show, we will have a live Q&A called After Effects, and you will see an option to enter your questions in real time into the Mentimeter while the presentation is ongoing. Dr. Brown and I will take your questions from the Mentimeter poll and answer them at that time. Our opening query question for today's presentation is, what are some of the ways that masking, wearing a mask to hide one's identity, can be used as a source of power? I like that question. Dr. Brown, how about you?
Pretty good question. Yeah, I'm excited to hear what the responses are going to be.
Yeah, we should be able to see those as they come in.
Okay.
Okay. Dr. Brown, you might have to read those off to us. Do you see any of those that you like? Deflecting others or tempting, like keeping your true a secret? How do you tell the difference between a vigilante and a masked hero? I don't know. Neither do I. think that's
Direct
from,
quote from the series.
yeah.
So the surveillance of authorities, keep up your boundaries.
Resisting voyeurism.
Power of anonymity enables the power of escaping boxes put onto one's racial, gender, class, and other identities. Whoa, okay.
That's a good question. I mean, I imagine you're going to hit on some of those pieces in your presentation, I would guess. That's a great question. I like the idea of the courage to try something you otherwise wouldn't do. I think often we associate masking, there are negative aspects of masking, like this deception or the like, but masking also is a powerful gesture, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely.
No.
You no longer have to base your decisions on what others perceive of you. Okay. All right. Oh,
No.
Harriet Tubman's being invoked. Okay.
I saw that. Yeah, I'd like to see her on some money soon. I don't know about you, but
I don't know.
we'll see how that goes. Hey, we're about out of time on the Mentimeter questions. Thank you, everyone, for participating in that. I just can't wait to hear your presentation, Dr. Brown. I have more to say, but we need to turn the floor over to you. Hey, don't forget to keep the link open, the query, opening the query to participate in the live Q&A. You'll see the option to open the Q&A on your screen, and any questions you submit through the Mentimeter, Dr. Brown and I will try to answer as many of those as possible during the after effects at the end of the presentation. Well, hey, Dr. Brown, it's all on you.
Thank you, Finney. Thank you, Dr. Coleman. Good afternoon. My name is Dr. Kimberly Nichele Brown, and I'm excited to be here. I'd like to begin by thanking the Leadership Council Director, Ms. Catherine McGill, Ms. Shauna Brown, Ms. Kendra Hill, Ms. Tanya Bryant, and Mr. Mason, as well as the entire New Mexico Black Leadership Council team. I'd also like to thank my longtime friend, Dr. Finney Coleman, for putting my name forward as a speaker for this event. The title of my talk is I've Got a Nose for White Supremacy and He Smells Like Bleach, Regina King, Subversive Masking, and the Making of Sister Night. In order to ease you into what I anticipate will be a heavy discussion about race, I want to preface my talk with a brief stanza from George Benson's Masquerade. Can we have the next slide, please? Although there are other notable renditions of songwriter Leon Russell's Masquerade, the only one that I ever truly acknowledge is the version by George Benson, released in 1976, because this song, along with so many others, served as the soundtrack for my childhood. As a girl, however, the lyrics that signal the demise or simmering of a torrid love affair were beyond my comprehension. But the soulful quality of Benson's voice moved me even then. Benson's Masquerade comes back to me now in the most ironic fashion as I navigate a world that looks very different from what I thought the future would be when I was a child. Decontextualized now in my imagination from the literal failed romance about which Benson croons, I interpret the lyrics in light of the failed promise of a post-racial future that has dissolved into this present resurgence of white supremacist organizations, such as since Trump's election in 2016. For example, according to Southern Poverty Law Center's 2020 Year in Hate report, quote, white nationalist hate groups in the US have increased 55% throughout the Trump era. The Guardian reports that, quote, nationally, there were 155 such groups counted last year, and they were present in most states. These groups were counted separately from the Ku Klux Klan groups, racist skinheads, Christian identity groups, and neo-Confederate groups, all of which also express some version of white supremacist beliefs. Damon Lindelof Damon Lindelof, the creator of HBO's series Watchmen, explains the impetus of the show stemmed in part from the events that unfolded during the now infamous Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, Virginia. This was on August 11th and 12th of 2017. Lindelof explains, quote, people kept saying, I can't believe they're not wearing masks. They're not wearing masks anymore. The white supremacists are just out there and we can see their faces. Emboldened by 45, a skewed interpretation of patriotism and the Bible, many white nationalists have learned that a mask is necessary in a world that affords them carte blanche on the basis of the color of their skin alone. With the emergence of COVID-19, to mask or not to mask has been a widely debated and heated topic that has also been racialized in a myriad of nuanced ways. Recently, Regina King, who plays Angela Abar in the series, spoke on the show's continued relevance and the fact that it's been picked up more since the quarantine. You have people, this is a quote from King, you have people who are watching it for the first time during the pandemic after George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, and being more aware of the history of police brutality, violence against Black Americans, and so they are receiving it through a different lens. As a race scholar, I suffer from no delusion that America is showing us her true face. And yet, battling two viruses, Corona and white supremacy, has taken its toll. Much has been written about the disproportionate ways that COVID-19 has negatively impacted Black communities that were already suffering residual health issues, most likely induced by racism and racist trauma. I see this slide right here as a mediation on the quotient violence that encapsulates so much of Black life. The mundane experience of shopping while Black meets what I call supermarket terrorism. These images of whites casually donning Klan hoods or Nazi paraphernalia juxtaposed with images and testimonies of Blacks reprimanded for wearing masks that supports Black Lives Matter, or Blacks forced to unmask and put their lives in jeopardy to appease whites who mark them as already criminal. The absurdity of racism and white supremacy would be funny if it wasn't lethal. Because of my research, I've been interested in the various ways the mask and masquerading have been used in contemporary, popular, and visual culture. However, for me, Benson's voice takes on a haunting tenor, because in many ways, I believe that we are lost in a masquerade. So what I mean by being lost in a masquerade, I've kind of tried to outline here. So I want to think through issues in the larger project of masking and COVID-19. And so is masking an act of protection? Is it an act of criminal subterfuge and terrorism? So my first iteration of thinking this through is making a sort of connection between wearing the hoodie and wearing the hood. And so by wearing the hoodie, I'm referencing Trayvon Martin. And by wearing the hood, I'm referencing the Klan regalia. So the masked or hoodie, the masked or hoodie wearing Black is always already criminal. And I'm interested in the ways that we have become imprisoned in the mask in an entirely different sort of fashion than what we've talked about with Blackface minstrelsy and Black performers as being imprisoned by the mask before. And I'm thinking of Burt Williams more specifically, but I'll talk about that later on. The other part of this would be then thinking about the Klan hood and supermarket terrorism, as I've just showed you with the last slide. And then the other way that I'm thinking that we're lost in the masquerade is the co-option of Black liberation rhetoric and activist tactics by the right. And so lost in the masquerade is another one of sort of these devices that I'm looking at to think through this historical moment and its own special madness. This talk comes in part from my book project that Dr. Coleman mentioned, Incognito Stances. Incognito Stances, Cross-Racial Espionage in Contemporary Literature and Film. And so this project unpacks the various stealth and racially strategic metaphors associated with taking an incognito stance, i.e. double consciousness, masking, being a spy in the enemy's country, etc. Whether the passing subject is Black, white, or indeterminate, incognito works as a moniker because the stance the subject takes hinges on the subject's commitment to anti-Blackness and the socioeconomic advancement of all Blacks. There are three main definitions that I want to point out that underscore my project. The first is cross-racial masquerade. And so we can think of this on some levels as synonymous with racial passing. When someone legally classified as one race passes her or himself off as another race. My employment of cross-racial espionage is a phrase that I've coined to talk about the act of passing that occurs when legally classified Blacks or whites pose as members of the other race for a higher egalitarian, insurgent, or moral purpose, rather than just for sort of individual gain. The topic or the phrase that's going to highlight or is the focus of this particular talk is subversive masking, which I coin as being the tactical use of the mask that offers those who wield it a sense of agency and empowerment because she or he is able to use the belief of Black inferiority against Blacks, against whites. Now, when I'm talking about masking, there are two main literary antecedents that I owe my coinage to. The first is Paul Laurence Dunbar's 1896 poem, We Wear the Mask. We wear the mask that grins and lies, it hides our cheeks and shades our eyes, this debt we play with human guile, with torn and bleeding hearts we smile, and mouth with myriad subtleties. The last part, the last stanza, you can see where Dunbar is meaning for the mask to have a sort of strategic valence for African Americans. We smile, but oh great Christ, our cries to thee from tortured souls arise. We sing, but oh the clay is vile beneath our feet along the mile. But let the world dream otherwise, we wear the mask. The other literary antecedent would be Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man. And this is a quotation that comes from the text that are the dying words of the protagonist's grandfather. Son, I'm gone. Son, after I'm gone, I want you to keep up the good fight. I never told you, but our life is a war, and I have been a traitor all my born days, a spy in the enemy's country, ever since I gave up my gun back in Reconstruction. Live with your mouth, live with your head in the lion's mouth. I want you to overcome them with yeses, undermine them with grins, agree them to death with destruction. Let them swallow you whole until they vomit or bust wide open. Now, I read the Watchmen in the context, let me actually leave on this one. I read the Watchmen in the context of an influx of films and television programs made in the wake of Black Lives Matter and in response to Trump's presidencies. Some titles include W. Kamau Bell's United Shades of America, Ryan Coogler's Black Panther, Carlos Lopez Estrada's Blind Spotting, Donald Glover's Atlanta, Spike Lee's The Klansman and his Netflix series She's Gotta Have It, Terrence Nash's Random Acts of Flyness, Jordan Peele's Get Out, and Us, and also Boots Riley's Sorry to Bother You. And I'm sure there are others that I might have missed that I could put on this list. Like earlier African-American satirists, the directors listed above provide counter-hegemonic programming to challenge the pervasive ideology of post-truth currently circulating in public discourse. Michael Sawyer describes the concept of post-truth as a postmodern strategy created by the right to dismantle epistemological principles that the nation has held sacrosanct. Distinguishing the phenomenon from lying or political spin, Sawyer contends, quote, regimes of post-truth seem to depend upon establishing an archive that is accessible to and understandable by the public, of self-referential data points that are not verifiable through other methods of establishing objective facts. I submit then that many Black filmmakers forego realism as an approach, not because such a filmic strategy would fall flat with audiences who have grown suspicious of scientific inquiry, but who question traditional, let me start over. I submit then that many Black filmmakers forego realism as an approach, not because such filmic strategies would fall flat with audiences who've grown suspicious of scientific inquiry and who question traditional epistemological frameworks, but because it does little to placate the effective needs of Black and progressive audiences. I argue instead that we are experiencing a shift from social realism to Afro-surrealism as a filmic strategy for depicting Black life and telling Black stories. This would also entail a shift from elucidating and educating whites about social inequality to an effective mode of filmic storytelling that attends to the emotional needs of Black audiences who long to see our racialized embodied existence as a focus rather than as fodder for white consumption. Additionally, although there are several aesthetic reasons for using the term Afro-surrealism, I use it here in a more colloquial manner to describe how many of us experience this current moment as aberrant, bizarre, and surreal. Therefore, elements of magical realism, genres like science and speculative fiction, and then fantastical elements in general seem more appropriate. Although my general focus throughout Incognegro stances has been Black filmmakers and producers, I've been persuaded to widen my definition of Black cultural production with the arrival of Watchmen and then later Lovecraft Country. While I hesitate to call Watchmen an Afro-surrealist series, I see it as a form of filmic reparation. And here I'm borrowing from Laurie Lambert's coinage of the phrase, poetic reparation as a, quote, work that seeks to address the structural inequalities embedded in colonial and post-colonial archives. Set in Tulsa, Oklahoma, HBO's series Watchmen depicts an alternate 2019 stemming from the 1985 historical events portrayed in the comic book maxi series created by the British creative team of Alan Moore, Dave Gibbons, and John Higgins. While the maxi series focused on the nuclear arms race between the USSR and the United States, Lindelof says he asked himself, quote, what's the big cultural anxiety now? And the answer was, there's a reckoning happening in America as it relates to race. And so as archival context for the show, Lindelof points to events at Charlottesville. He talks about Ta-Nehisi Coates' Between the World and Me and his essay, A Case for Reparations, as being major influences on the making of Watchmen. He also speaks about being influenced by the report that Black Panther was going to be in production soon. And so that made him think about Wakanda and the notion of, I guess, African exceptionalism. And then he was thinking this through. And then for him, Tulsa of 1921 would be a reflection of African-American exceptionalism. And then he says, if white people found out about it, they would burn it to the ground, meaning Wakanda. And this is exactly what happens in Tulsa, 1921. So what we get with the Watchmen is an alternate Tulsa, Oklahoma. You can read here that we have the King Act, which enables police officers to hide their identities by wearing masks after the White Night Massacre. And this is the massacre that happens on Christmas Eve. And you have a massacre in the sense that because the police officers weren't masked, they were murdered by a white supremacist organization. We know that the US has acquired Vietnam, and so that's another state now. We have cell phones not existing, but pagers do. And the country has done right by Black Americans in Tulsa specifically by offering them reparations. And then reparations also come in the form of something called reparations, because Robert Redford is the president and he offers the police officers involved in the White Night Massacre reparations for their trauma. So for me, why I'm interested in the Watchmen is because I see it as disrupting the hegemonic gaze. I need to put my glasses back on because I can't see this print anymore. All right, so in terms of disrupting the hegemonic gaze, I'm thinking about theories on Black spectatorship and oppositional discourse by people like Mantia Diawara, who coins the phrase resisting spectator to talk about Black people's participation in the viewing audience of films. And he uses The Birth of a Nation as his reference point. Stuart Hall and his idea of the dominated hegemonic viewer, the negotiated viewer, and the oppositional viewer. Bell Hooks's coinage of the oppositional gaze. So all of these kind of undergird my employment of what I see happening with the Watchmen. How the Watchmen disrupts the hegemonic viewing practices, it does so by centering race. And so I see it as anti-racist filmmaking. So the creator, Damon Lindelof, this is what I said before in terms of some of the context for the text for the series. But then there's also a centering of Black spectatorship. And so, in a lot of the things that I'm thinking through now, I'm thinking about like the difference between bearing witness versus understanding sort of like trauma porn, and how we have to toggle between the two things. So in the larger chapter, I'm looking at subversive masking in all of Watchmen. So the first thing that you get is from Hooded Justice, who am I? If I knew, I wouldn't be wearing this effing mask. I've got a nose for white supremacy and he smells like bleach. People who wear masks are driven by trauma. And then finally, Will Reeves says, you can't heal under a mask, Angela. And so we want to think about like the importance of masking as a strategy, but also in terms of when masking becomes a liability. Masking as a strategy for resistance. So the remainder of this time, I'm going to speak about the making of Sister Night. And so I think about Sister Night as a superhero, that's true, but I also think that she's a very specific type of superhero. And so the kind of superhero that I think of her as, I put her in conversation with the notion of being sort of like a race woman. And so the race woman was a term used to describe public women of African descent who aimed to uplift the race. Race women saw it as their duty to play a leading role in solving both the race problem and the woman question. Now, generally when we're talking about the coinage of the idea of race woman or race man, we're talking about 19th century figures who are navigating a very sort of racist terrain. And I'm thinking about people like Ida B. Wells, Ella Baker. To talk about Abar as a race woman, though, means that her superpower is fighting white supremacy. Now, this becomes a kind of sticky wicket because she's also an agent of the state, meaning that what does it mean to think through a Black cop basically having at the forefront of their agenda fighting white supremacy. The second part here, what's in a name, Angela Abar and Sister Night. So Abar derives from the Latin words istuus or I can't do Latin at all. Or istus, which both mean just. So already I don't even know if this is intentional or not, but we already have her as like a figure of justice in her name. And I think initially I was just looking at Sister Night and what that name might represent. But I want to kind of think this through in terms of perhaps being deliberate, because I also realized that there was a movie, a blaxploitation film that came out in 1977 called Abar, the first Black Superman. It was later repackaged as something else. But to think about Abar as a name that encompasses not just the idea of justice, but also the idea of a legacy of Black superheroes. And in terms of Black superheroes, there are a lot of different directions I can take with this, but I think that I'm thinking that like with COVID-19 and the Black Lives Matter movement and other work that I'm doing, I talk about the film Girl with All the Gifts, and I prefigured that figure as a superhero. But really, I think the Black Lives superhero that we might be most familiar with would come from Luke Cage. Uh, but this is something sort of different, because how I pick the Watchmen as my focal point, and also thinking through white supremacy and Luke Cage. Initially, Luke Cage starts off as a bulletproof hero, but there are not a lot of direct confrontations with white supremacy and Luke Cage, right? And with Abar, she's taking on white supremacy head on. And I think that that means that we are dealing with a different type of superhero. And we're also dealing with a more sort of more nuanced way of thinking about a superhero that doesn't mean that in order to placate white audiences that we don't tackle white supremacy and police sanctioned violence against Black head on. Right. So in the world of Luke Cage, a lot of the animosities that you see are happening in sort of like an insular section of Harlem that is generally populated by all Blacks. What's in the name? The persona of Sister Night is born out of trauma. And there are two specific traumas. The first one is the White Night Massacre. And this is a fictitious event discussed as background for Abar and Sister Night's character. So Sister Night is Abar's alter ego. She even has her own like supercar, her like Batman. But she's also a figure of trauma in terms of Black Wall Street or the Tulsa massacre that happened in May 31st and June 1st of 2021, excuse me, 1921. What a slip. So just a quick sort of recap, understanding Tulsa in 1921. So we have the Tulsa Race Massacre that's also called sometimes the Tulsa Race Riot. And it was one of the most severe incidents of racial violence in US history. It occurred in Tulsa, Oklahoma, beginning on May 31st, 1921, and lasted for 2 days. The massacre left somewhere between 30 and 300 people dead, mostly African Americans, and destroyed Tulsa's prosperous Black neighborhood of Greenwood, known as the Black Wall Street. More than 1,400 homes and businesses were burned, and nearly 10,000 people were left homeless. Despite its severity and destructiveness, the Tulsa Massacre was barely mentioned in history books until the late 90s, when a state commission was formed to document the incident. Now, the other way of thinking about Regina King, the other way of thinking about Regina King, specifically as Sister Night, as a race woman, is also how the series tackles mothering of white children. So in the actual series, Angela Abar's, during the White Massacre, Angela Abar's partner and his wife are murdered. And so she and her husband, Cal, take over the raising of their 3 children. Then what we have going on in the series is, I think, a disruption of our understanding of Black women mothering white children. And I see it as a way to decolonize our notions of mammy versus mommy. And so when we're thinking about mammy, I'm thinking specifically of Patricia Hill Collins's employment of mammy as a controlling image that she sees as the penultimate controlling image for African-American women. As such, when we think about stereotypes, we think about stereotypes sometimes as just sort of existing in a vacuum, but what Collins tells us is that stereotypes are really made in service to the state. So the big thing with Mammy is that she serves as sort of like the best relationship that the state can have, or the most preferred relationship that the state can have with Black women, because Black women are nurturing and raising white children at the expense of their own. And so to think about, for a long time, I had to think through why Regina King takes on this role where she's actually um, mothering white children, right? So on the offset, I'm thinking that um, this is a situation where she's going to be sort of like nurturing. This is a situation where she's going to be mammified in particular ways. But I think that what happens is sort of decontextualizing, or a decoupling of Black women caring for white children as always already being mammy. And so for me, the distinction between mammy versus mommy is the distinction between paid labor and love, right? And so it's important, though, if we think about her as a race mother, a race woman and a surrogate mother on top of that, what she says to Topher once her police captain is murdered. So she tells him that his uncle has been murdered, fake uncle, but also a police captain that she much respects, and that their families are kind of intertwined in a lot of ways. So she says, there are people who believe that this world is fair and good. It's all lollipops and rainbows. I remember what happened to my parents. You remember what happened to your parents. You and me, Topher, we don't do lollipops and rainbows because we know that those are pretty colors that hide the world, what the world really is, black and white. And so what I see happening with this particular conversation, and also how their relationship works throughout the series, is that she's giving him lessons in racial consciousness that might be thought of as lessons in how to be a proper white ally, rather than thinking about it in terms of how can she be of service to Topher. And I think that this is a very instructive moment in the series, because we see Topher sticking up for her in a classroom situation where she's getting heckled by another student who's probably like a racist in the making for having reparations. And so to think through that distinction between mammy versus mommy, this is kind of like, I think, a really sort of interesting move that the series makes, because we're not really dealing, again, with this notion of subservience. We're not really thinking about how her life has to be supplanted for these white children, but rather how these people are being supplanted, rather how these people are joined by the destruction that racism causes, both to these white children and also to Abar and her family and the other police officers. Now, with Sister Night, and also with a lot of the characters in the film, in the series rather, I'm really interested in issues of costuming. And so here you see 4 pictures. I want to talk briefly about the first 3. So Sister Night is wearing a cape, a long leather jacket, a long leather coat rather, with a hood. And then we can juxtapose that with the image of Hooded Justice. Hooded Justice has on a hood, but he's also wearing a noose around his neck and noose ropes around his wrists and around his body. One of the things that we understand with Sister Night through some sort of organization that tracks descendants of those in the Tulsa riot through their DNA. So they track direct descendants, is that we understand, and it's the plot spoiler, that Hooded Justice is actually Angela Abar's grandfather. The one, excuse me. All right. Angela Abar is the Hooded Justice granddaughter. Now, one of the things that I want to sort of point out here is that the sort of use of masks that we see here. So what the series is trying to kind of figure out is, does vigilante justice go too far? What's the difference between vigilante justice and policing? But the move that I think is very interesting that the series take is actually going to the idea of blackface minstrelsy, where we get to watch the Hooded Justice as a younger person blackening up his face, right? And so how I want to round up how I want to round up this presentation is to kind of think through very briefly the connection between these acts of masking and sort of blackface minstrelsy. So the legacy of Burt Williams looms large in this conversation. Burt Williams was a performer who was one of the most preeminent and popular vaudevillian performers, who was like a Shakespeare trained performer who actually wore blackface on top of his regular makeup. And so what I want to kind of do in the larger project is talk through, and I can talk to you more about this in the Q&A, how Sister Night acts as an antithesis to blackface minstrelsy, right? So if blackface minstrelsy is a condition where an actor like Burt Williams might get caught up and subsumed in the blackface tradition, get consumed by wearing the mask, then what Sister Night is supposed to be doing is trying to make sure that she also doesn't get imprisoned in the mask. And that's the dance that goes back and forth between the two. So I'm out of time because I want to leave time for questions, and they're digging in. So thank you very much. And I look forward to answering whatever it is you might like to ask me.
Snaps all around for Dr. Brown. Thank you, Kimberly. That was brilliant. I think we have we'll have some of the Mentimeter questions pulled up here. Before that comes up, you know, when you saw the trailers, the initial trailers for this, Dr. Brown, Kimberly, I mean, I remember watching them and I was expecting her to have superpowers, right? Like being able to fly or something. I don't know, when I first saw it. But when the series actually aired, and I kind of see her in that Batman kind of you know, super in terms of intelligence, in terms of being able to see things and be things that the average person was. That wasn't disappointing in any way for you, was it?
No, because I think that it actually went over my head that she didn't have superpowers, because I think that there's a way that Angela Abar and Sister Night, the sort of dual persona, gets caught up in this whole sort of rhetoric that we have circulating now, that's really like Black girl magic, right? And so there's a quotation that King says where she talks about how she doesn't like that term because it's not really magic that Black women are doing. It's competency, it's hard work. All right. And so like for me, I'd already kind of folded this performance into sort of like feats of excellence and feats of like making a way out of no way that I've grown accustomed to thinking about Black women's resistance traditions throughout our time on this United States of America.
Yeah, I mean, I recently had a student ask me about the the role that Black Lives Matter has played in kind of shaping the possibilities for Black women, whether it's made it worse. And undergirding her question was the notion somehow that the remarkable things that Black women like, Patrice Cullors or Abel Tometi or Alicia Garza, the things that they're doing are somehow new. And I had to point out that this is nothing could be further from the truth. I mean, you'd have to not know about Phyllis Wheatley. You'd have to not know about Pauline Hopkins, Ida B. Wells. People know to some degree about Sojourner Truth and Harriet Tubman, but the Black woman as heroic, both in real life as well as in our fiction, that's been a mainstay, it seems to me, in Black literary history and culture. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I think that it also is sort of the cornerstone for things like womanism. If you look at Alice Walker's definition of what a womanist is, it includes that sort of notion of heroicism by Black women. But I think that the larger sort of issue is that we have a situation where we are disconnected from our legacies of struggle. And so that's why during the summer, you would see people saying, I'm not my ancestors and things like that, and wearing those T-shirts or those having those particular placards. But if they really knew who their ancestors were, they would know that we've been here before. So that's one of the interesting things that I think happens with this show is because it gives a nod to a notion of generational trauma built on racism that we normally try to kind of forget in this country, regardless of color. Like we don't know as Black people who did what before. And then also, like we have a situation where people are not, just think about like the fact that the Tulsa riots, like people were talking about like that's like a new thing. Like everyone's still like just so shocked that this sort of happened, right? But the fact that we're disconnected also from the kind of traumatic racist things that happened in the past and that are happening now, I think are the really interesting sort of moments that we need to address. Yeah.
Let's give Mason a moment. He has to give some instructions for the Mentimeter. Can you go ahead, Mason,
Yeah,
please?
sure. Thank you so much for that very thought-provoking presentation. That was amazing. I took some notes here. And so, yes, we're going to jump into the Q&A. I see that quite a few questions were dropped in. But before we do that, we would love for everybody on the call to let us know how we did. It's with your support and feedback that we're able to bring these types of series to you. And so we're kind of at the mercy of the evaluation gods, as you see there, to bring us good fortune and then hopefully some funding so we can continue this work. So while you're still here on the call, we have a link in the chat that you can click on. It'll take you to a very, very, very short survey. It would mean a lot to us and to our organization if you could fill that out and let us know how we did. So you can use the QR code or you can click on the link in the chat. And so with that, we are going to jump into the after effects. Those questions that you asked Dr. Finney were kind of the same that I was thinking too, especially how she's perceived as this superhero or vigilante, I guess, in this show. So I think I saw some pretty similar questions in there, but I will turn it over to you guys for the after effects to close us out.
Great. So I can see just the original screen. I don't see the actual questions themselves. I'm not sure if I'm supposed to be toggling.
Well, I can see a question, but I don't know how to move between the questions. So
We'll have Kendra move through the questions for you guys. So we'll
Okay.
start with question number 1, and then it looks like we have about 10 questions. We may or may not get through them all.
Can you see the questions, Finney? You said you can't.
No, I see the first. I just see the first screen.
The first
Okay.
question is, do you view code switching the same as putting on a mask specifically for people of color?
I do. In the larger project, I talk about linguistical masking. So yeah, I do view it as the same way, but it would depend on to what degree. Well, I don't know. Yeah. So I think the short answer to that would be probably yes, right? Because I don't think maybe it doesn't depend on the degree. Yeah.
Yeah, and to what purpose it seems, you know.
Yeah, because if we're talking about code switching, like there's ways that I talk with my family that I don't talk, with my coworkers, and I don't know that that necessarily is putting on a mask. That's just sort of how I slip in and out of the subject positions that I inhabit. But if code switching can sometimes be used as a way to get a leg up in the workplace, where you talk in a more articulate manner, where you make sure that your level of understanding of English grammar is on point, that those kind of things. The movie that I use to talk about that, I have a chapter on Sorry to Bother You that I mentioned in the talk by Boots Riley. And in that, I deal a lot with linguistic passing.
The next question. What's the next one? Oh, wow.
Cross-racial espionage is a term that I came up with, and it's not perpetuated by gatekeepers. Cross-racial espionage is a sort of elaborate way of talking about how we use or how people have used racial passing as a strategy for resistance to anti-Blackness. And so I like the employment of cross-racial espionage because I think that it highlights that stealth possibility. So on some level, masking, if it's deriving from Dunbar's poem, is already a strategy, right? But to think about it as a strategy specifically that's for the betterment or racial upliftment, to use an outdated term, of Blacks is what I'm kind of interested in. A lot of the stuff that I have been reading about racial passing or cross-racial masquerading is really about individual game, people who do it for individual game. And I was curious about how that notion of cross-racial masquerading and the notion of racial passing was being lauded by scholars because that indeterminate or hybrid figure, or whatever you want to sort of call it, was being lauded by already being subversive from the mere fact of existing. And so I was pushing back on that a little bit because to do the passing if you're Black means that you have to disavow Blackness, and you also have to disavow your family. And so it's a problematic sort of thing for me. And so I was looking for a literary and filmic tradition where people were passing in service to the race, as it were.
Yeah, and I mean that's the importance, I think, or part of the importance of using that passage from Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man, the type of espionage, not self-sabotage. I think some people sometimes conflate the notion of sabotage with espionage, and it's quite different concept idea.
Unless if you're trying to sabotage white supremacy, then,
Yeah.
power to the people.
all power to the people.
All the time. Yeah. Uh-oh.
It doesn't look like it wants to go to.
Okay. Uh-oh, we lost it again.
Oh, had it.
Huh. Hmm.
I'll just jump in. The question is, uh, things do feel surreal and bizarre. This is not new, but it feels different and therefore, I guess, quote unquote, new. Do you agree? And if so, why? I think that is alluding to what you mentioned about Black surrealism.
Mhm. Yeah, I would love, well, okay, so let me just answer. I think that for me, Biden's presidency was lackluster on some level because I felt like all we really did was like move back to regular racism rather than like, the kind of like overt, real crazy racism that I had been experiencing as a citizen of this nation for like a while. And that doesn't mean that I am, that I didn't vote for Biden. What I'm saying is that like there are degrees to these things, right? And so I just need stuff to be like normal racism so that I can function because I've already knew how to function with that. But to have like such in your face stuff where you find people that are emboldened to do like just outlandish stuff. And so I think that it is new, but I think that, oh, yeah, it does feel surreal and bizarre, but it's not just like that. It's also the coupling of this notion of alternative facts and post-truth, like, so alternative facts in my head is a lie, a fact is a fact, right? But now we have alternative facts that coupled with that sort of understanding of a rise on white supremacy or white supremacist organizations, white nationalist organizations, is really sort of like over the top. So sometimes when people are posting things on social media, I can't always tell if it's real or like if they're being satirical, because there are so many crazy things that have happened since like, let's not even say 2016, but since 2015, leading up to the election, that I never would have thought was possible. So there are things that, talking about surreal, there are things that I had taken for granted my whole life that are now being like rescinded. Rape laws, thinking through again, like we're gonna, like, we were almost at a point of redoing Roe versus Wade. Like there were all sorts of things that I never thought that we'd be talking about now. Like really 2020, I was promised some flying cars. I wasn't, geared for this mess here. So to me, it's that combination of people obscuring like the truth, where you end up feeling crazy. Did that really happen? Did that not really happen? Am I insane for reacting this sort of way? But I'm also talking about it in terms of the responses that Black people do to push back against the absurdity of the event. Making like a name like Karen to talk about like people Karening out in the world and bothering Black people just going about their daily life, like that kind of like absurd pushback where you're actually sort of being poking fun at racism on some level to diffuse it. So all of these things to me go into the idea of that surreal feeling. Like all of the rules have gone for how we're supposed to operate in a democracy.
It's the changing same, and I think when we think about it in terms of generation cross, I think for many young people it does feel surreal and new because they didn't have that experience pre-Trump. They were young or they weren't engaged yet psychologically, just weren't at that level. I think about kids who are in their first years in college. For them, this does seem very surreal, in some interesting way. Trauma porn, is that what playing the George Floyd video over and over is? Yeah, I'm conflicted about this notion of trauma porn. What about you, Kimberly?
It depends, right? Because I think that what I trip over is walking that fine line between the need to bear witness and trauma porn, right? And so I wasn't just talking about George Floyd, but there's a way that social media has made Black death on like the front page, right? And so like I have spent a lot of time now, like I would think since 2012, looking at videos of Black death over and over and over again. And I never get desensitized to it, but I think that that also helps to, you know, think through this surreal moment, because I feel like if we don't think of, if I'm getting over and like inundated by these images, how many things have not been videotaped that are actually happening to Black people that we don't see? All right. And so the idea of sort of trauma porn is that my reaction to these things might be sort of different than someone who is a racist, right? You know, like they might get off on Black death in a way that I mourn it, right? But at the same token, if we didn't have the young woman filming George Floyd and refusing to put her camera down when she was told to do so, we wouldn't have known it happened. So like it's a bit of a balance. But I do think that I have been, and a lot of people might maybe agree to this, traumatized by certain images, which is actually why I started off with the collage that I made of the people in the supermarket. You know, like it's upsetting to me that in just going about your daily life, anything could happen to you at any sort of moment, regardless of your class status as a Black person in this country, right? Like there is no like a way to sort of like guard against it. So yeah, like it's a tightrope walk to sort of dance there. And I was mentioning the supermarket scenario because you're bringing something like really home at that point, right? Like that's to me like a pun on domestic terrorism in a kind of interesting way. So yeah, yeah.
No.
Mhm.
Wow. Well, you know, this is a horrible tragedy, and when we think about, I don't know if you can ever put a price tag on justice. I think that folk would very readily give back $27 million in that family if that would bring back George Floyd. I mean, that was more important than the money. And I think we all learned that lesson, that it's not so much that, you know, the settlement was just or unjust, but that it is a poor substitute for, you know, the person that's been taken away from that family and from the community, which is priceless.
Mhm. Yeah. Okay. In terms of power, I think about masking that is used in some traditional African cultural rituals where masks are used ritually or ceremonially to elicit various human and more than human spirits. Okay.
Yeah, I don't think there's a question. There's more as an observation. I think that's absolutely true.
Well, it's also good that you put it in because I hadn't really thought about that. Yeah.
Uh-huh.
But I'd say that Sister Night is similar to Misty Night in Luke Cage's story. Uh, I don't know. I'd have to think about that a little bit longer. I think that for me, like I really enjoy Luke Cage. I like that world, but I think that not just with Luke Cage, but also with Black Lightning, there's a way where all of like the villains are really still like Black people, right? And so for me, what's I find I like Misty Night, but I find Sister Night a little bit more interesting because we rarely see shows where people are going head to head with white supremacy, right? You know, and then when we do see those shows, they don't last that long, and they're pulled off. So I'm thinking about Underground more specifically. But with Sister Night, her backstory, I think, is unbelievably interesting in a way that makes her the superhero, where Misty Knight is like still on like sidekick range, right? Like, you know, she's not the protagonist of the Luke Cage story. Luke Cage is. So
yeah, and in her history, I mean, she has the first interracial kiss like Nichelle Nichols does in comics.
oh well,
But you,
then you know what? Then you know what? We should just give her a medal then, right? You know, because that's a feat in itself, kissing a white man.
I mean, the difference between the two, I mean, Misty Knight is enhanced bionic. I think the martial arts is what I think maybe people draw similarities to that because of her proficiency in fighting. But I see her as being a cyborg more than
Oh, that's a good point. Yeah. But I also think like it strikes me like I've been rewatching Watchmen, and I think I forgot how unbelievably violent Sister Night is. Like,
no,
she's a little crazy. Yeah, just like her grandfather. Yeah. So I mean, like, that's interesting. How do you think the mammy role plays out in government and academia? Well, let me roll back, you know, my own academic career and tell you. I think that wow, I can't talk to the government, but apparently I have lots to say about academia. I think that people have been trying to force me. People sometimes I don't know what to do with me at all. But you know, I get a lot of like feedback where they try to sort of force me into like this nurturing role, right? And it's not that I'm not nurturing as a person, right? But the way that they want me to nurture them is really sort of attending to their needs and putting my needs like to the side, right? You know, I've had conversation, you know, here's an interesting sort of anecdote from my Texas A&M days. This person was lamenting the fact that a woman that we both knew had like lost like a 10-year relationship. Her boyfriend left her, you know? And then I was just like, that's horrible, right? And then I was just like, you know, I haven't had a date living in this hellhole of a place called College Station, Texas in like 892 years. And then, and the woman turned to me and she's like, yeah, but you know, you can handle that. And I was just like, huh, you know, because what would make you think I could handle that? What made her think that I could handle that is because she had somehow encased me in this sort of like role as like an asexual person, all the while when her husband would say crazy shit to me all the time. So there's like a schizophrenic thing happening with what people expect you to be doing in the academy as a Black woman, right? You know, so then the pushback is, you know, you're intimidating. One day, I would like to be so intimidating that people would be too intimidated to tell me about that trait about myself. That's my goal. So, you know, you have something to add about mammy roles?
No, I'm smart enough to let that one go. We can go to the next question.
I think we're actually going to end the Q&A portion right here, actually. So if we didn't get to your question, maybe we'll be able to answer it on the final series, which will be next Wednesday. But yeah, thank you for those answers. Those are really, really insightful. And I hope that, you know, you guys watching got your questions answered or were able to think a little bit more about the topic here. And so one more time, I just want to remind you guys that we do have a closing survey that we would love for you guys to take. The link is in the chat, or you can use your phone to scan this QR code on the screen to go to that closing survey. It'll really help us out. And so let's give it up for our presenters, Dr. Kimberly Brown, and our moderator, Dr. Finney Coleman, for answering our questions and leading this lecture today. So drop some thank you, some hands, some hearts, some thumbs up in the chat. We really, really appreciate it. Wonderful stuff. I actually haven't seen the Watchmen TV show yet. I just finished watching Lovecraft Country right before we did our last lecture series. So now this is I love to be framed up when I watch something. So now I have a lot to think about in the back of my mind while I'm watching this. I'm kind of like a film TV person, and I try to think of all the intricacies. So I'm going to take my notebook and I'm going to start watching it tonight. And we want to give a thank you to our staff that makes all of this possible here at NMBLC. So big thank you to Catherine Miguel, Shauna Brown, Kendra Hill, Amber Jeanson, Tanya Bryant for all the amazing work you guys do to bring these events to life. Don't forget to connect with us on social media at New Mexico Black on Instagram, at NMBLC on Facebook, and our website, nmblc.org. And if you have any questions, you can feel free to shoot us an email at info@nmblc.org. And like I mentioned, we are going to be finishing up our Afrofuturism Lecture series next week, Wednesday, same time, same place. That's March 24th with Dr. Andrea L. Mays, professor at University of New Mexico. If you haven't signed up for this presentation, you still have an opportunity to do so by going to our website. And links for that will also be in the chat. And finally, I'd like to thank the African American Student Services at UNM for being a partner for our series. Special thanks to Brandy Stone and Johanna Gordine for all of their support. And with that, we will close out our series for today. We look forward to seeing you here next week for our final lecture series. We'll be welcoming back Shauna Brown, our Deputy Director, as host. Thank you once again to our moderator, Dr. Finney Coleman, and our presenter, Dr. Kimberly Brown. Have a wonderful rest of your evening. Thanks for joining us.